Welcome to the Divine Identity Podcast. In this episode, we are examining the debate between 𝗪𝗁 and Robert Bolog over the Trinity, asking what each side gets right, where each model struggles, and whether Scripture itself provides a better way to understand the one God and His Son. Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to look at the Trinity and oneness debate, see how the one God is revealed, unpack the emergence of Jesus, test this against the most difficult passages, and finally present a new biblical alternative. Let's jump right in.
Section 1. The Trinity and Oneness Debate.
To really understand why this debate often feels like it's just spinning its wheels, we have to look at the historical dilemma. Both classical Trinitarianism and oneness theology raise absolutely legitimate, crucial biblical concerns, but they both tend to operate inside philosophical categories that Scripture itself never actually establishes. Notice the tension here. On one side, Trinitarianism gets it completely right by insisting that biblical distinctions cannot be erased. Jesus prays to God, God sends the Son. That distinction is real. But the struggle happens when that very real distinction is automatically projected backward in time as an eternal distinction between divine persons. On the flip side, oneness theology is absolutely right to insist that biblical monotheism has to mean something. God is numerically one. The problem, though, is that it often collapses the real human Son into the one divine subject, which kind of makes it seem like God is just talking to himself. Ultimately, both of these are incomplete solutions.
So we really need to reset our theological starting point. Let's just step away from systematic categories for a second and ask the central fundamental question straight from the text. What kind of being is God, and what kind of being is the Son? Until we directly answer that from Scripture, we're really just shuffling labels around.
Section 2. The One God Revealed.
Before we even talk about Jesus, we have to understand how the Old Testament uncompromisingly presents the nature of God. Scripture begins with the one God who creates entirely alone. In Isaiah 44:24, God explicitly says He's stretched out the heavens by myself. Furthermore, Isaiah 31:3 tells us that God is uniquely spirit and kind, as opposed to flesh. So we have one divine subject, one single who, and one divine what, which is spirit.
Now, this one spirit being isn't just a blank, uniform void. Scripture actually distinguishes real internal realities within God, but crucially, without turning them into separate persons. We call this aspectival monotheism. It's the consistent biblical pattern of emphasizing simultaneous, distinguishable realities, or aspects, that belong intrinsically to the one spirit being. Basically, it's distinction without separation.
Scripture breaks this down for us really clearly. First, there is God's soul, which is His intrinsic personal I. Then there is God's form. This is His personal living structure. You can think of it as an eternal spiritual body, which figures like Moses are actually said to behold. And finally, there is God's inner spirit, His inward divine life and power. Psalm 33:6 brings this all together beautifully, showing the one God acting through His form, described there as His mouth, and acting by His own Spirit. These are incredibly real aspects of the one God, not additional persons.
Section 3. The Emergence of Jesus.
Now we're shifting from the nature of the one God to the origin of the Son. To really understand Jesus' identity, we have to use biblical anthropology, which means we actually have to look at Adam. In Genesis 2:7, a human person comes into being through the union of two things, a physical element, the dust of the ground, and a spiritual element, the breath of life. When those unite, a living human soul emerges. The person is the result of that emergence. In 1 Corinthians 15, verses 45 through 47, Paul specifically calls Jesus the last Adam. This is a huge clue. It tells us that Jesus' identity follows this exact same pattern of human emergence, just with a very unique spiritual element.
Let's apply that emergence framework directly to Jesus. Mary supplies the physical element, but instead of a human father providing the rest, God provides His own eternal form as the spiritual element, acting by His Spirit and power. And what's the result? Jesus emerges as the real human Son. He didn't pre-exist as some separate person floating in eternity. He emerged right there in history as a genuinely divine human being because His very spiritual infrastructure is God's own form.
This connects so naturally to the prologue of John. When John speaks of the Word in John 1:1, he is foregrounding God's own form in expressive action. The Word was with God because God's form is distinguishable from His soul. And the Word was God because, well, it is God's own form. When John says the Word became flesh, down in verse 14, he's describing exactly what we just talked about, the emergence of the Son. And through this entire process,
God himself remains the single, active subject.
Section 4. Testing the difficult passages.
So, let's put this to the test against the toughest verses used in the 𝗧𝗵𝗃 debate. Take Jesus' agonizing prayer in Gethsemane from Luke 22:42. Trinitarians will point to this to prove there are two distinct persons, while oneness thinkers often have to jump through hoops to explain it. But using our framework of respectable monotheism, this is genuine soul-to-soul communication. The human soul of Jesus, the personal I that actually emerged in history, is speaking directly to the divine soul of God. The distinction is absolutely real because the human soul and the divine soul are distinct realities, and yet Jesus remains entirely grounded in God's own form.
Let's do a rapid-fire look at a few other problem texts. In John 17:5, Jesus speaks of glory he had before the world began. How does that work if he emerged in history? Well, we can understand this through the personal predicate principle. Think of Galatians 2:20, where Paul says, "I have been crucified." Now, Paul's physical body was definitely not on the cross with Jesus, but he applies that predicate to his whole person because of his union with Christ. In the exact same way, Jesus predicates eternal glory to himself because his identity is perfectly grounded in God's eternal form. What about Jesus' baptism? The simultaneous activity of the voice from heaven, the Spirit descending, and the Son standing in the water simply shows God acting through his various simultaneous aspects at once. It absolutely does not require three different people. And in Colossians 2:9, as well as 2 Corinthians 5:19, we see clearly that God is fully present in the Messiah without Jesus actually being the Father, because God's form is his very infrastructure.
When we look at Hebrews 1, we see the Son described as the exact representation of God's being. This makes perfect sense because the writer is speaking from the standpoint of the already emerged Son, because the Son's core spiritual element literally is God's own form, the very reality through which God reveals himself. The Son can represent God perfectly without needing to be a second eternal person and without just being a temporary mode of the Father.
Section 5. A new biblical alternative. Here is where we bring it all together. The crucial takeaway is this: we don't have to choose between a Trinity that multiplies divine persons or a oneness theology that collapses the genuine human Son. We have a solid biblical alternative. There is one personal God. There is one real human Son. God is fully present in that Son through his own form, and God acts through him by his own Spirit. This model completely preserves the strict numerical unity of God and the genuine humanity of the Son, doing justice to the best arguments of both sides. So here is a question to leave you with. If we strip away centuries of philosophical categories and just look at the text, is this beautifully unified scriptural picture of God the one you've been searching for?
For a fuller exploration of this teaching, read theologian and teacher 𝗂𝗵𝗃 article, Beyond Trinity and Oneness, What the Debate Missed About God and the Son, available at christrooted.org.